Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining me. I'm very excited to share my talk on the materiality matrix, a practice-based perspective on responsibility. This study is a portion from my doctoral research on the phenomenon of responsibility in business, together with my advisor, Professor Yotam Luria. My name is Inbal Sternberg, and I'm passionate about sustainability and responsibility in business. I currently work in a sustainability and corporate responsibility director position for a large aerospace company in Israel. And as a professional in the field for the last 2 decades, I'm constantly aware of this gap between the way CSR is perceived and generalized by stakeholders and the actual day-to-day activities that take place within the organization. It is reflected nicely in this chorus, translated freestyle from a song written by Yaakov Rutli, which became a common figure of speech here in Israel. Things you can see from here, you can't see from there. I soon realized that I have a unique position to research responsibility from the perspective of a practitioner, so I decided to pursue this as my doctorate research. I will begin by introducing some background on responsibility in business and the practice-based approach. Then I will review the methods used and some key findings, and finally, I will discuss the meanings and contributions of the study. When we look in the literature for responsibility in business, the focus is mainly on the organizational phenomena of CSR, which grew in the 1960s and 70s with the culmination of civil rights movements and the regulatory advancements in America. In many respects, my study takes a very different perspective, moving against this prevalent research direction. The GRI disclosure standard came about as a platform that was designed to advance transparency and dialogue around CSR. Companies that choose to disclose their environmental, ethical, economic, and social impacts voluntarily need to engage in the practice of materiality assessment, which ultimately yields the materiality matrix. Then, a report needs to follow on each of these topics. For those of you who may not be familiar with the materiality matrix and what it looks like, here is the one for the company I work for as published in 2021. The format follows the form suggested by the GRI guidelines. As you can see, it includes the domains of governance, economic, environmental, and social, and the topics are ordered based on how significant the impact the topic has on the business and its stakeholders. The published matrix represents the top ranking of a much larger list of material topics, as implied by the light gray rectangle you can see at the bottom left of the slide. The materiality matrix is mostly treated as a tool that allows companies to understand the influence of stakeholders' expectations on their business value. Once disclosed, stakeholders expect the business to actively manage these impacts in a strategic way, rather than just satisfying the materiality assessment requirement in the GRI standard. Because the matrix is viewed as a disclosure tool, it is usually studied in isolation from the practice that created it. Many studies focus on the content. For example, comparing topics between businesses in the same sector, or how topics changed for one company over the years. In short, studying what the matrix is. This study, on the other hand, offers a change in perspective to understand how the business is actually moving to align its strategy with the identified material topics. In other words, what the materiality matrix does. This means perceiving the matrix as being performative, as an object with an impact on the day-to-day social reality of the organization. To do so, we chose to adopt a practice-based perspective. The practice-based approach dates back to the 1970s, but a return to using practice theory in management and organizational studies occurred at the turn of the new millennium. With a growing community of scholars now from around the world studying various social phenomena in the organization, such as strategy as practice, marketing as practice, and so on. There is no one unified practice theory. Instead, practice theory is an umbrella term that stems from several research traditions. From Marxist traditions, for understanding practice as a web of activities where knowing is not separated from doing. Phenomenology and Heidegger's idea of design, claiming that an object cannot be understood in separation from what has created it. Bloomers' symbolic interaction, with its focus on how language and symbols mediate human behavior. Wittgenstein's notion on how practice is advanced as action by language and receives meaning. And lastly, posthumanism, as offered by Latour and Pickering, noting an agential existence by objects and their impact on social life. There is an agreement, however, that different practice theories share some common vocabularies, and to use this approach means committing to these shared vocabularies and orientation. The practice approach uses practice as a unit of analysis, not the actor, not the organization. When we focus on the practice elements, humans, objects, knowledge, and so on are entangled and present equal agency to be considered. Meaning, discourse, knowledge, and order are all parts of the practice and being produced by the practice. We study practice as it happens, as a situated endeavor at a certain time and place. It is best if the practice is not just observed from above, but also engaged in, a point that we'll talk more fully about in a few minutes. Finally, the social phenomena, which in our case is responsibility in the business, is an outcome of all the connections formed within and between the organizational practices. And so when we study practice, we're observing and engaging with all of its elements, as shown in this image. And most importantly, we look to see how they entangle with other practices across space and time, and how their connections and relations are either negotiated and formed, or is simply missing. The study I present today focused on the following research objective: understanding the meaning of the materiality matrix when we look at it through practice-based lens in a business setting. The matrix then becomes a gateway to my research focus of responsibility as practice. Similar to how other scholars in the field has looked on such phenomena as leadership, strategy, and innovation, as I already mentioned. I already established that choosing this approach is a commitment to a certain method. Essentially, we take the object, the materiality matrix, and ask some thought-provoking questions in order to understand and trace the ways this object actually connects to organizational practices and the meanings that are produced because of these connections. For example, to understand the situatedness of the matrix, we ask how it came to be, where is it being used, and for what? The materiality matrix received its name to equate material with important or significant, not to be confused here with the meaning of material being an artifact or an object. To understand the matrix as part of a complex material reality, we study its connections to other organizational objects. And as knowledge is considered an element of practice, we study the matrix for the knowledge it carries. This is important, for example, in the context of onboarding novice managers or employees. We're looking to be as close to the practice as possible as we perform zooming in, a practice-based activity. For this particular part of the study, we were zooming in on the materiality assessment practice. And as I explained, the matrix is just an entry point and a sample from my larger research project that involves following other organizational practices that entangle with this particular practice. I promised earlier to give a bit more information on my dual position as a researcher and a practitioner. Much like in anthropology, one of the ways I identified to return to practice in organizational studies was by allowing the perspective to emerge from within the practice itself. This means that the researcher is part of the practice itself and able to describe and reconstruct the practice elements and the connections between practices as a narrative. This is achieved by employing an additional method, autopraxiography. As you may know, autoethnography allows social researchers to reflect on their experiences as part of the social phenomena studied. Here it is adapted as autopraxiography, meaning that the researcher/practitioner reflects on the practice. For these reflections, further connections and practice elements can be traced. I will now review some of the study's findings. We begin with the situatedness of the matrix. In the table before you, which represents a sample from a larger table, you can see the different actors who engage with the matrix on the first column, the various activities involving the matrix in the second column, and the different times in which these engagements occur in the third column. For example, in the row of the employees, you can see an interesting activity called remembering. The materiality matrix is part of the company's mandatory sustainability e-learning. Through this e-learning, new employees are introduced to the material topics of the company and the way the company manages these impacts. This e-learning is then taken periodically as a refresher. At this point, employees engage in remembering the matrix and the socially shared meaning it carries within the organization. You can also see that managers are utilizing the matrix for policymaking. Each material topic identified in the materiality assessment practice became an actual wording, both in the matrix and in the company's sustainability policy. Next, we look at materiality. In this table, which again represents a sample from a larger table, you can see the different organizational artifacts and objects connected with the matrix on the first column, the various ways these connections occur in the second column, and the different ways these connections remain intact and sustained over time in the third column. As we just discussed policymaking, note here how the policy as a document object directly connects with the matrix such that any changes in one transforms the other. This connection, as well as other connections to both the policy and the matrix, serves to sustain it over time and make it durable. Another object that is connected is the company's strategic sustainability plan. This vital connection determines which practices will continue to exist in the organization and which will either cease to occur or not be adopted in the first place. We can already sense the powerful role that the matrix play here as an organizational compass. And again, as the matrix changes, as was the case in 2020, when the new topic of business continuity was introduced to the matrix, a strategic plan adaptation follows. As for knowledge, the matrix carries embedded jargon and rules that are socially shared between communities of practice, and through its connection to the GRI guidelines, which also represent a community of practice. Here you can see an interesting use of the materiality matrix during a strategic planning meeting on which we performed a zooming in. The topic at the center of the discussion was responsible supply chain practices. During that meeting, the matrix was presented to the participants with the red markings to indicate how decision-making in this area directly connects, relates, and has a potential to impact other material topics in the matrix, and therefore additional organizational practices. Making these relationships visible and more tangible through the matrix affords these communications between different organizational units or communities of practice. It literally directs future discussions of the supply chain personnel with EHS or IT personnel in the organization. To summarize, we go through another practice-based activity, zooming out, to consider the bigger picture here. The matrix is not simply locked away in the annual CSR report as a mere disclosure tool, but is actually being engaged with as part of the everyday social life of the organization. Its performativity produces tangible impacts. Through its connections to different organizational activities, objects, and actors, the matrix put things into motion. We found several meanings with relation to responsible management within the organization that are produced when we view the matrix through practice-based lens. Being an instrument of responsibility, making some of the organization's responsible practices traceable through a socially recognized form and jargon. Being an embodiment of transparency, as changes in practices reflect on the matrix and changes in the matrix reflect on the organizational practices. It can make tangible what responsible means for a specific company. It is bridging communities of practice by materializing a connection between different practitioners and organizational disciplines, and even to external practitioners, such as ESG analysts. Finally, we saw it can serve as a strategic compass, connecting to future activities and practices the company will engage with while eliminating others. I hope we managed to demonstrate to you today how the materiality matrix could be used to study responsibility as a social organizational phenomenon, how it could actually play a complex role when we studied it as a carrier of practice and as connected and not as isolated from the practices which created it and sustain it. and that practice-based approach could be used to research these important phenomena and to allow fresh perspectives to emerge. This topic is indeed rather new in the current research agenda and was studied in a single company. As I mentioned, this study is only a sample for my larger doctorate project. I plan to continue to further research other practice elements about this social phenomena in the organization, as well as using the practice-based approach to further explore additional phenomena. In general, this study revealed opportunities to explore other companies and industries that engage with CSR disclosure, using their matrix as a gateway to their day-to-day responsibility. I thank you for listening and for your attention and look forward to continuing the conversation.